George MacDonald played a very significant role in C.S. Lewis's life. C.S. Lewis is a very complex person in that some are drawn to him because of his rational, his logical arguments justifying Christianity, trying to make sense of it, his role in apologetics. And so the whole interest in terms of the role of reason as a means of defending the faith, Lewis has been front stage in that. But there's the other side of Lewis, the man of the imagination, the man of intuition, the man of images, the man of stories, of narrative, of myth. And in one sense, that mythic side, that imaginative side of Lewis is far deeper than his rationalist side. And so when Lewis was going through crisis in his life, in which early years of education, he was very, very much shaped and formed by a particular thinker. Kirk, he was called, one of his early tutors. There was also at Oxford at the time logical positivism, linguistic analysis, more sophisticated approach to the role of reason in knowing and not knowing and justifying. Lewis got to a point in which just the use only of reason as an organ of knowing increasingly was leading him to despair, to cynicism. And so he, as I mentioned earlier, he actually was drawn to Christianity, not primarily through logical arguments. It was through the great myths of Greek and classical and Nordic thought, Scandinavian traditions, and so you get these two sides in C.S. Lewis: the imaginative and the rational, the logical and the narrative, the mythic, the intuitive. And so what you get, George MacDonald is one of the, in terms of the 19th century Victorian writers, Lewis Carroll, he was associated with many of these people. He was writing very important works, enticing, in fact, entrancing, in terms of the role of myth, of story, of how it opens up the soul to much bigger vistas of longing, and where longing can be directed to. And so, for example, Lewis's one of his second autobiographies, Surprised by Joy, that builds on Pilgrim's Regress and is much more attractive. Joy becomes, in that sense, a guide to human longing. And the bulk of George MacDonald's writes deal with joy. And how does one direct longing? What are the deepest longings we should heed and hear? And in MacDonald's works, whether it's Phantastes or Lilith or Back of the North Wind or Gifts of the Christ Child, we can go on and on with his major works and fairy stories. They awaken in the soul a hunger for something greater, and they present a sense of the holy, not sense of ethical holy, but holy in the sense of presence. And a drawing of hunger and desire to the various people in the stories that MacDonald works. This touched Lewis. Lewis was drawn beyond the rational through the mythopoetic, and it was MacDonald's works that in fact stirred in him and validated in Lewis in a much richer and more sophisticated Christian sense. The Christian myth. One of Lewis's great sayings is, just as myth transcends history, so the incarnation transcends myth. It's the great myth of the dying, resurrected God you find in Roman and Greek and Nordic myth and many of the other great civilizations. So George MacDonald, probably more than any other 19th century, conjures up in his myths, in his stories, this sense that there is something else in life. There is a greater reality beyond time and history. There's a dimension that if you just stick your hand through, it is there, waiting for you to go through it. And whether it's the Curdy stories, as I mentioned, and the Goblin, story after story cascades out of MacDonald's fertile imagination that cannot help but drawing people to that other dimension, to that what the Celts would call the thin places between time and eternity. And as Lewis is reading all of these works of MacDonald, increasingly so, the child within him awakens again to that other dimension, that hunger for that other dimension, and then how does one live in the tension between eternity and time? Obviously, in Chronicles of Narnia, you go through a passage door. In other works of Lewis's, there's other means of transporting or portals between these two times. MacDonald articulates that in a far more nuanced, compelling and attractive way than Lewis did. And I think this is why Lewis calls MacDonald his master. So when Lewis reads works like Phantastes and Lilith, he all of a sudden is stirred and awoken and said, yes, now I can understand why this trip into the other dimension is valid, it's real, and I'm not going to turn my back on it, and if I do, I lose my soul in the process. So a certain form of reason, in one sense, was a form of Judas that betrayed the imagination. Through MacDonald, Lewis's imagination was awoken and validated, and hence this is why Lewis considered MacDonald his master, and out of that came many of Lewis's works of the imagination, which have held many for decades, and of course have been produced as films. But in one sense, I think it can be argued that George MacDonald is a greater imaginative writer than Lewis. He wrote far more than Lewis in terms of the imagination, and his works in terms of going through that other dimension, or the pathway between the two dimensions, are even more compelling and convincing than even Lewis wrote. And this is why I think Lewis looks up to him and doffs his cap and sees in George MacDonald the great teacher of fantasy and the important role of fantasy as literature. And fantasy, I won't even say as apologetics, because they're not trying to do apologetics, they're just trying to open up other ways of being and seeing, of knowing, through storytelling. And that is George MacDonald's great genius.